So we will start the class today first defining creativity. Trish did a definition last week, so I just want to go quickly over this. Creativity involves the generation of an idea that is new in some way. That's really, really important. So generation and idea, new idea is important here. An original idea is one that is statistically rare or infrequent. So you may have ideas that will look similar to others, but as weird and rare the idea gets, more creative will be according to this definition. The idea must be appropriate, relevant, or fit generally, generating a useful, workable, effective, and satisfying and adaptive solution. So we cannot talk about creativity if the idea just, explode in your mind, but it's about nothing in particular, because then doesn't fit any purpose when we follow this definition. Then two additional researchers describe two elements that may be interesting also to consider. One of them is surprise, that creativity, generation of ideas usually is related to generate surprise, and production, which is also related more to product-driving creativity, when you need to produce something for people expecting something from you. So the elements in general are generativity, novelty, appropriateness, goal-oriented, and surprise. Oh, and product in the case that you were about to produce something. Now, when we talk about creativity, it's important to leave clear that novelty, anything that is new, will always come from something old. Old will be a referral for what we are creating, and novelty is always related to something in the past. The best example I can give you of this is this timeline that many of you might have seen before. This is the process, the creative process of Pablo Picasso in different times of his own life. So the years appear here in the corner of the painting. These are portraits. And here are the years where he created these portraits. And you can see an evolution from his practice, from very realistic type of portrait and slowly evolving to Cubism and to all the period that Pablo Picasso was known for. Now, he didn't came with these ideas just from, thin air. They come rooted from different influences. And even inside of the creation that he developed during the years, he have referrals and influences from different things. Like, it's well known, and it was shown here in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, his influences from African culture. Now, how we represent knowledge in the brain, because we are talking about generating from old things. So we generate something new from something old. So that means that we must have all this information in our brain already. It must be there. It must be represented in some way in our brain. So we are talking before, right, about this famous apple that we are using several of our examples. So how we represent that apple in our brain, what do we know today? In the past, people used to believe in this theory, right, in phrenology, that there were areas of your brain that were particularly related to certain traits of your personality. Phrenology was wrong in the sense that it was trying to classify people according to different type of personality, and was pretty much bound to racial aspects and pseudoscience. But it was right in the sense that in the brain, there are places where you can actually kind of map and see information stored. And this is the best example I have of this. Is a beautiful research done in the United States by, I forgot the name now, Halligan Labs, where they actually did a semantic map of words in our brain. And I want to show you these, guys, because it's absolutely beautiful. So let's see if I can, go there, and there you go. So Gallant Lab. So what is loading right now, and I will include this link for you, you can copy here, it's gallantlab.org, is based in a study that they did where they used many, many different words. And every time that someone was listening to this word in movies, they will see which parts of the brain will give illuminated in functional magnetic resonance experiments. So as you see, let me just hide the surface. No, there's the brain, the polarity, pivot, unfold. I think just trying to hide the head. So what we have here is a map of different words in the brain. And if I go and click in one of these areas, for example, that voxel over there, I will get all these words that are related to that particular area. What is interesting about this particular map generated by this group is that show that concepts like this are actually international accepted. So even if in your language you use the word murder in French and the word murder in Spanish should have the same location in the brain. So it doesn't need translation. What is also very interesting about these maps is that you can see that the amount of different terms that are registered here, like order in visual, tactile, outdoor, place, numbers, body part, violence, person, social, mental, and time, are distributed all around the cortex in the brain. So it's not particularly in one area that we store the information, but in the case of the semantic maps, it's stored all around our cortex, and we can access to them in different ways. As I said before, I will include this link for you guys to explore and have fun. It's really, really a beautiful, oh, here's the sky. There you go. Now you can see just the brain. So, for example, if we go here, the words are now Mario serving, custody, convicted, Aspen. If you go here, you will have, when the words are more tiny means that it's less resolution for those particular words. But you will have areas where the words are really like more located in these places, especially when they are bigger in the graphs that is showing here the website. So I will leave this for you to research later, to look at this later. So then we know today that information in the brain is represented extensively over the cortex. What is interesting from the study of Gallen is that the information, even when it's represented in the cortex, is in gradients. So you will not see like, okay, exactly in this, little crevice, I will find, where's my mouse? Okay, exactly in this little crevice, I will find the word love. But it's actually a gradation of the word again stored in this part of the cortex, and depending on the person, you will find in different locations, but it's mostly there. Now, since the information is stored in the brain, how we access to that information, right? Because we put it there. I haven't said at all like how we put it there, right? We have different processes in neuroscience that we've seen that are happening here. One of them is a string of synapses. Like, remember these connections that were between neurons? We're seeing in some of the cases to generate memory, when you string these synapses enough, these synapses will stay forever. And this will be translated to something that stay there like a concept. We actually don't know how the word, like car get coded in the synapses. We think that every time you string many synapses with the concept of car, then you are creating now a physical place in the brain to this happen. But we still are not sure if this is really what is happening in human brains. Now, how we think we access to that information that is stored over the cortex? We know it's there. We don't know exactly how it's stored, but we know it's there. How we get to that? This is what research has pointed us today. What the brain does is recognize patterns. So patterns are defined as networks of strongly interconnected neurons. So neurons that will be fired together. So when you make one of the neurons fire, this neuron will activate a complete pattern of network of neurons. Now, this activation will happen through a sensory input. As an example, we have the apple again, and this apple will be called attractor. What the attractor will do is through a different entrance, get information to the network that later will be analyzed inside the network and will give you the most probably object that what you are observing or testing. To do this, for example, we will use vision or touch or taste, just to give you 3 of the sensory inputs. So if I use vision, I'm watching the apple, the information enter, and since the network of the pattern for apple is interconnected, this entrance will activate the complete network and will give me as a result the concept of apple. I will obtain the same activation if I use touch. And instead of, if I kind of blind myself by touch the apple, the same sensitive entrance will now activate the same network, which will give me the same concept, apple. Sensing for taste. How we know all this? How we know that a network can be active by different sensory stimulus, but this sensory stimulus will still activate exactly the same network? Through something called agnosias and apraxias. Agnosias and apraxias are basically a fail in the cortex to recognize a particular stimulus. One of the most famous one, and I put it here as one of the movies, like, is prosopagnosia. I think I mentioned this before, but Oliver Sacks, a famous neurology, he did have a mild case of prosopagnosia, which is basically not being able to recognize the face of people. Even if they are family members, you are not able to recognize them. Remember that we saw this a couple of weeks ago, and I leave some videos for you guys to review in Moodle about, particularly about prosopagnosia, about not being able to recognize the faces. So what happened in these conditions is that basically, if we could do an experiment, let's say we remove the other sensory stimulus, like we will have the apple again. I will not use touch, I will not use taste, I will just use vision. If I use vision, I'm able to see the apple and say, okay, that's an apple. If I remove the vision stimulus, like because it's a damage in the cortex, even when I have my apple in front of me, I will not be able to say this is an apple. And actually I will lose the connections inside of the hidden layers and the concept will not come to my mind. If I use any of the other stimulus sensories like touch or taste instead, I will activate again this network and I will know again that this is an apple. And this is what happened in these patients. They see the apple, they don't recognize it, but once they touch the apple or they taste the apple, they know now we are talking about an apple. So thanks to that, we know that information in the brain is stored in forms of patterns, and you can activate those patterns through different sensory stimulus. Now, I will come back to something I told last week. Remember that is this popular belief that the brain is divided in left and right for creativity and for logic. And the truth is that we saw last week that it's not such a thing, really, that that artistic sensitivity can be located in both sides of the brain. And we know that, again, for accidents that people have had where the brain has got damaged in one of the two hemispheres. And before and after, these patients still display beautiful skills, artistic skills. So in that particular time, we know that there is no such a thing like artistic, creation is in the left and logic is in the right, or vice versa, something like that. That say, the brain do have something called lateralization, which is mean that some functions of the brain are more located in one side than another. Here I'm showing you just some of the part of the cortex that we have seen before, right? The vision, the motor cortex movement, and somatosensory cortex, and auditory cortex. But in the particular case of language, these areas called Broca area and Wernicke's area are areas that are lateralized. They are located in the left side of the brain in people that is right-handed. So the Broca's area is related to production of language, and the Wernicke's area is related to comprehension of written and spoken language. And we know again that when there's damage in these areas of the brain, people get something called aphasias. That is, again, the impossibility to develop language or comprehend language. What this shows us also is that some areas of the brain are lateralized, which doesn't mean now that language resides just in the left area of the brain. This is very important. Indeed, we know that even when the left area is important to develop the language, the right area of the brain in the same part is important for the emotion that you put in the language. Again, we know this thanks to aphasias. Like if you get a Broca aphasia and a Wernicke aphasia, means you have damage in your left side of the brain. And if you get damage in the same areas in the right side, you get something called aprosodias, where you speak with no emotion in your language. What is interesting again of this, this is another example of pattern recognition, because people with aprosodias still have all the emotions. They feel love, they feel fear, they feel all of them, but they are not able to vocalize them. And they have to mention the emotion that they are feeling. There are some cases of professors actually doing this to make their students to understand that they are happy or upset about something, even when the voice is totally monotonic. Another type of agnosia that happen lateralized is prosopagnosia, which happen again in the right side. So this is just to tell you that the brain do have lateralization without this being the same that you have a right brain that is creative and a left brain that is logic. The brain distributes all this around the cortex, but lateralize some particular functions, more in one area than in other. So talking about this, pattern recognition and novelty in our brain are things that seems to be lateralized. Studies have shown that the left side of the brain is better at pattern recognition and the right side of the brain is better at novelty recognition. We know this again through experiments. So, for example, there is studies where show that when you manage a complex skill as a professional and you are having an fMRI about that, the part of the brain that is actually more active is your left area. Again, so if you're a professional and you have a pattern, it means that you know already what you are doing. The area of your brain that is active is the left. If you are a novice in this particular skill, let's say you are started to learn to play the violin, what is getting active now is mostly your right side, because the activity that you are doing is new, it's novel. What is interesting is more time you spend practicing, the activation starts to pass from right to left. So from being something new to being an established pattern that you now dominate. The same thing happened with high practice skills, with a familiar cognitive task, and here I have a beautiful example of this. So this is an example done a couple of years with studies in fMRI. Scientists were realizing that the fMRI per se was creating an activation of the brain. Every time you were putting someone in the machine, the right side of your brain was getting active when this person was for first time going under that experiment, showing that this was new. More the person was getting in the fMRI, less activation of the right you were getting, and more activation of the left you will get in recognizing this now just as a pattern of something that you already know. There's tons of examples of this, but for time I will not go over them. So now, how we generate new ideas in the brain? We just talked about these patterns of recognition of something, right? So I can have a man and a lion, and I can recognize them using these patterns in the brain and tell you like, okay, this is a man or it's a lion. But a big, big difference is generate something new, like the example of the lion man, one of the first sculptures of something that was a chimeric creation, something that doesn't exist in real life, a man with a head of the lion. This is something that since doesn't exist, you don't have the experience of this. You haven't seen it. in nature. So it's not stored anywhere in the brain. It has to be created. It has to appear as a new thing that your brain did, not that was experienced, but you create. And this per se, and this is very excited, even when it may seem not, this is very excited because this means that someone was able to take two things, all things, and create one totally new that doesn't exist, that was generated just by the brain of that person. So as I say, recognize a pattern is different from generate something that does not exist in the brain library. This is called generativity. And I put a Lego piece here because it's basically what you do. You have tons of Legos and now you just start to organize them in different ways that never existed before. So generativity is the ability to juxtapose all elements into new configurations. And this is a unique attribute of your prefrontal cortex. Remember, the front of your brain, the newest part in evolution of the brain, and it's mostly well developed in humans and in some primates. Generativity is a property also of languages. Languages are like Lego blocks. And again, language is something that's mostly, developed and evolved in humans. This doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in other animals, but it's as right a higher peak in humans. And one particular ability of languages that's called recursion is even more complicated and require more generativity. That is when you can put in a phrase, contain statements inside that phrase, and of that phrase, even more statements, like a matryoshka doll. So the key here is the prefrontal cortex. And you already know this gentleman over here, right? The guy that got his brain blown up and still survived, but after that was not able to behave as a normal human being in society. So the prefrontal cortex, for study purposes, we divide it in different parts. The parts that we will be interested today are the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex that, as I say, dorsal means side. So it's the side lateral of the front of your head, and the ventral lateral and orbital frontal cortex. That means the part that is more related to your belly. That means ventral, from vientre, the Latin ventre, which means belly. So the part that is more related to your belly and more related to your orbit of the eye, that's called orbital, is the other area that we will talk a lot today. The other area that we will talk also is the anterior singular cortex, which comes from the word ring, right? Singular, like ring, and it goes inside of the cortex. What these areas of the brain does is basically being like librarians. So what they do is they take information that you have stored in the rest of your brain and bring it to work with it. So the ventrolateral cortex, is like orange and red, will be mostly working in relation to the outside world to get information about things that you already know, bring memories and things like that, and being able to take decisions in a society. Then the dorsal media, which is in the front, will be more related to integrate information that happen in the other areas of the cortex. And the areas below, like orbital, ventral, will be related with salient. Salient here means something that interests you, that is important as a stimulus, something that is very, get out of the norm, something that will kind of like call your attention. Now, as I said before, right, these areas of the brain in your prefrontal cortex will work as librarians. That means that you will go to the desk, ask the librarian for a book, and then the librarian will have to go to pick up the book in some place where all the books are stored. So how the brain does that? We have some ideas. Oh, that's something, another thing that's very interesting I wanted to tell you guys. The prefrontal cortex, the area that made you being, like a mature human being, actually matures around the mid-30s. So 35 years old, then is really mature. So before that, don't worry, you still can do stupid decisions. It's just part of your brain not being there yet. So don't blame yourself if you don't take bad decisions when you're younger. You will arrive to some point when you will say, is to blame the prefrontal cortex maturity. Okay, so I was telling you, like, this librarian have the information that you need, how it does. What we know today is that the brain can access from the prefrontal cortex to all the areas of the brain through different connections that go in networks. And here I have two beautiful photographies taken with a technique that is called tensor diffusion imaging, which what it does is track the axons, basically. So we have the nucleus of the neurons in the prefrontal cortex or in whatever part of the cortex, and then what you see here are the different axons going to different areas of the brain. So we're seeing that what the cortex does is access to these other areas. Now, we know there's connectivity between different areas of the brain, and we saw last week, right, when we were talking about the default mode network, we say that it gets active when you are experiencing art, and we say also that these areas are well connected, and this part of the image was the most important one. Like, they were well connected with different parts of the brain, and that's what every time that you were watching, observing art, you will experience it at the same time other areas of your brain get active, like reward or self-awareness, of empathy, because those other areas in the brain will also be active once you activate this network. Now, what are these particular networks that are interested to us in creativity? There are three. Trish mentioned them last week. So the first one is called the default mode network. What you see here, if you're interested later, are these numbers here are called MNI coordinates, and they will define the X, Y, and Z points in a space inside the brain. So I will also put this website for you to enjoy. So this is the jail MNI map. So you can include here the coordinates for an area, for example, -5. So you see that it moved, and then to the base of the brain. Then I will put the next coordinate that is Y is 45, which, as you see, it moved now to the front of the brain. And then I will put the next coordinate, which is 6. And now we are again in the base of the brain, but seen it from dorsoventral aspect. And this is the area of the brain that we are seeing in this photography here. So, and what we are seeing here is the activation of this area of the brain with the default mode network get active. So, as you can see, the activation that happened in this network is mostly in the frontal part, plus some back part of your brain. We will see right away the names for those areas. The other network is the salience network. And the last one is the central executive network. Now, what they do, the default mode network is mostly interested in introspective areas of the behavior. So it will get active every time that you are doing basically introspection, and basically when you are not thinking. So it will go and examine your inside. When I say inside, I don't mean guts. I mean more like your internal world. It will go with mind wandering. It will go with the location of yourself in a space and in relation to the people. It will go with empathy. It will go with how you can imagine futures. One of the big things that we'll do is also counterfactual thinking. So seeing possibilities of things that doesn't exist. And it will be at work when you are not really thinking in the problem. Then the and is composed by all these areas that you see here in this drawing. So it will be the orbital frontal cortex working, plus parts in the back of the brain that will be the posterior parietal cortex, precuneus, and posterior cingulate cortex. We will see these three areas very soon, so don't get worried yet. The next network, the Salience network, what it does is act as a switch. What it does is every time that something calls your attention, basically something that matters to you, it will kind of wake up from this state, from the default mode network, and pass to an active state, which will be the central executive network. This network will be working every time that you are focused in a particular problem. Try to really solve something, mathematics, logic, a problem of creation. Any problem that you are solving in the moment will get this network active. And again, the areas that are active in this particular network are another part of the dorsal, the prefrontal cortex, and back again, the area where you get stored information. And it has to do really with extrospective, so with things that happen outside your world, things that require your attention. These networks are anti-correlated. So that means that when the default mode network gets active, the central executive network is not active. And when the central executive network is active, the default mode network is not active. So they anti-correlate. Now, what they really do? Well, what they do is, you can see in the example before, that both of them have part of the prefrontal cortex active. That's what I mentioned before at the beginning, right? Like I say, like the prefrontal cortex is really important. It's the librarian that will go get books for you, but it will get active in two different ways when these two networks are working. When the network that is working for you to solve problems get active, one part of the prefrontal cortex is active. When you are resting, another part of the prefrontal cortex is active. And this is basically the activations. When you are not thinking actively in a problem, what your brain is doing is basically working with memory retrieval, autobiographical information, emotional salience, and space memory. This is the area that get activated in this little purplish area, the posterior cingulate cortex. Then this area here, we talked about this last week about your vision. When you are observing something, a particular work of art that have elements of space, this area get active because it has to do with space exploration, environmental gestalt, mental imaging strategies. And these two areas will be called by the prefrontal cortex. The other area that will be called also by the prefrontal cortex, before that one, is the posterior parietal cortex here. So this is more in the center of your brain. This is more to the lateral side of your brain. This area is primarily advocate to motor sensation, to somatosensory information, and sensory cortex. It means things related with touch, with things like smell, with proprioception, with movement, and will also involve things like reason and attention. So these three areas will be called by the ventral orbital frontal cortex, so they are in the below of your prefrontal cortex. And this will allow us to process things like emotional appraisal, social behavior, counterfactual thinking, emotions, and encode value to situations. Again, these go in the introspection value of the activation of this network. When the Salience network gets active, what it does is basically evaluate things like attention, what is important for you, then take decisions from that, see if these have any moral implications, impulsive control, and have a big connection with the limbic system. So basically we'll tell you like, okay, it's time to wake up because this is more important. This is more, important for you as a person. And then the insula that we saw before related to disgust and empathy will also get active and will basically bring you to the consciousness, to self-awareness, to empathy and homeostatic behavior in general, which is really important for what will happen next, which is the activation of the central executive network, when you want to now your brain start to work in the problem. What does is activate the other part of your prefrontal cortex, which has to do with decision making. Basically, it's that. What it does is decision, deception and lying, strategy, moral judgment, reasoning, working memory. That part is really important, working memory. And we'll also get active the area where we have to do with motor, sensor, and somatosensory information, again, but now under the control of the executive network. So we know the information, there is connections between frontal cortex and parts in the back of our brain. We don't know yet how the information gets from the back to the front. Why this is important? Because the information is stored in a certain place, and then what you do is you bring it to basically to the front of your head to processing, to work with that. To do that means that you are taking a copy of that, means you are getting the information generated now in the front. However, do that create tons of problems because means you are creating something that you have already created in the back, bring it now in the front where you already have other processes happening, and the information that you are putting in the front is just temporary. You have to remove it there when you get, the things done. So we don't know yet how the brain does that. We really don't know. We don't know how the brain accesses this information to put it in the front. We know its connections there, but we don't know how the brain bring it now to the prefrontal cortex to work with that. We have some ideas, and the best idea that we have so far is something called dynamic network connectivity, which use basically one type of neuron that we discussed really, really early in the classes that's called pyramidal neurons. These neurons in the prefrontal cortex are extremely well developed. And what you see here is just a comparison between two cortex pyramidal neurons, one in the visual cortex, the red one, and one in the prefrontal cortex. These two are in macaque, which also have prefrontal cortex. And you see that already in macaque exists a huge difference between visual pyramidal neuron and prefrontal pyramidal neuron. The amount of dendrites and spines that they have is way major in the prefrontal cortex. Now, if this is not a big difference already, here in this graph, you see the number of dendrites and spine, means the possibility of connection that these neurons can make when you compare them between baboon and different monkeys, marmosets, with humans. This graph here shows you the comparison, the comparison of numbers of spines in relation to humans with the other primates. So we have around 2 times or 4 times, depending on the primate that we are comparing, of possibility to do connections. What scientists think today is that these neurons in the layer 3 of the prefrontal cortex are responsible to make the connections necessary to be able to visualize and copy information from the back of our brain. Now, this still needs to be further tested. So this is the best that we know right now about the subject, unless you guys know another paper there around the problem. Okay, so how now we generate novelty? So here I bring something that comes from evolutionary epistemology that is called blind variation selective retention. And what it says is basically that we can generate novel things by just launching different type of concepts, one after another. And then some of these just selectively stop them and store them. This is a really, really cool idea. And we think that actually the brain do something like that. The brain get all this information in the back and is constantly appearing in the front and generating new concepts, matching different things that are unmatchable. And then slowly some of them pass the test and say like, okay, this one, we will use it. This is good for the idea that I'm trying to create. The problem with this idea is that it requires infinite combinations in a time constraint. And human beings live just maximum 80, 90 years old. So to generate a new idea using this without anything else will be impossible, just for the amount of time that you would require. To solve the problem, this is a mathematical problem. To solve this problem, there's a solution, which is constrain the possibilities by guiding the process. So instead to let the brain just like crazy looking for information, you constrain it. And you say, okay, you are just looking for things that are color red. or you are just looking for things that sounds like a mambo, or you are looking just for things that smell good. This will again be rooted in all things, in things that you already know. So any creative breakthrough, as I say here, comes from the combination of sustained intellectual effort extended for a long period of time, and the new is usually rooted in all. So if we get these two ideas together, plus the constraint, we can create something that's called directed wandering, where you let your brain go in this process of blunt variation, selective retention, but you are now directing where to go. How the brain will do that. There's three concepts that I want you just get there around. One is vistability, the other one is hyperfrontality, and the third one is hypofrontality. Vistability is basically a system that has two states and move between these two states. One state that could be active, inactive, or yellow, red, etc. Our brain does that. So we have two networks, right? SEM, Central Executive Network, and the full mode network. And the brain moves between these two. One is active when we are thinking in the problem, and the other one is active when we are not actively thinking in the problem. So our brain works under this condition. Then hyperfrontality are states of high activity in the prefrontal cortex that happen when you're awake or in active mental state. And they can be seen in fMRI when you are thinking in a problem, particularly in a problem that is like a very complicated and you have certain constraints that you have to do. You will see that certain areas of the brain in the front get very active. You know, when you see like, oh, my head is like in flames. It's funny because it's basically kind of the idea behind this, that your brain in the front will get very active because you are thinking a lot in the problem. You will see this also in a lot of mental illness problems as something that is not normal. But in normal conditions, it will happen when you are thinking really strong in solve a problem under stress. Hypofrontality, which means basically that now the frontal cortex gets down, will happen when you have lower states of activity in the prefrontal cortex that will be during sleep, hypnosis, and trance-like states. And the best example in real life is meditation. What is interesting about these two aspects of activity in the brain is that they are very related to perspiration and inspiration. And indeed, researchers have shown that in EEG studies, you can see variations between up and down of the cortex when people is solving problems in divergent thinking tasks, which are very much related to creativity. So we will have our brain, our frontal cortex, can very active and then going down, and active again and going down in these examples. How this is related with creativity, or how we think that we could use this for creation. Well, I want to show you here a particular problem. I will start with a story. So this is the story of the hen and the golden eggs. And probably you know this story, and it goes like that. A man owned a hen that was laying golden eggs. The man was greedy and wanted more gold at once. He killed the hen and cut it open, hoping to find a lot of gold inside, but there was none. We all know the story. Now, this particular story was used by Dr. Elkohon, let me find the name, Elkohon Goldberg, to study how damage in the prefrontal cortex affects the other cortices. And I want to read the story to you from this patient that he recorded. A man was living with a hen, or rather the hen was the hen's owner. She was producing gold. The owner wanted more gold at once. So he cut the hen into pieces, but there was no gold at all. He cut the hen more, no gold. The hen remains empty. So he searches again and again, no gold. He searches all around, in all places. The search is going on with a tape recorder. They are looking here and there, nothing new around. They leave the tape recorder, turn it on, something is tweeted here, some digit, 0, 2, 3, 0. So they are recording all these digits, not very many of them. That's why all the other digits were recorded. Turned out to be not very many of them, so everything was recorded. I will tell you what, there were only 5 to 6 digits there. I asked, did you finish? No, not yet, he said. I will finish soon. So there were only 5 to 6 digits there. When they took bus number 5, so you get there and transfer to bus 5 and get to Bauman Square. You go further on here to take off, and again you take bus number 5, and the story continues. So this is a case study of prefrontal cortex damage by Elkohon-Goldberg. Funny enough, it sounds like a Trump discourse here, but it's not. So, funny. So what this shows us, and this is very important, is that something happened when the prefrontal cortex is damaged. We talked before that was certain lateralization of aspects of the brain. These men have damage in the complete prefrontal cortex. So we talk about that one area was related with pattern recognition, one area was related with novelty. I will introduce here 2 new concepts. One is called small word networks, and the other one is just basically no small word networks. What these concepts say that the small word networks is that you have several nodes that connect to each other. These nodes create little groups or neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods are able to connect very tight to each other, but also to other nodes and neighborhoods. The other one is you have these neighborhoods connected really good between them, inside them, but not really well connected outside. This is something that's been shown through brain imaging, that our brain basically works in this way. The right side works more like a small word network with several connections that go back and forth between different areas of the brain, and the left side works a little bit more like no small networks. Now, why I mention this? Because in the case of damage, in the particular case that we are seeing here, you see in the damage of the right side of the brain, extreme exploratory behavior, novelty seeking, and jump from one task to another. When the damage is in the left side, you see persistency, stuck in a task, repetitive behavior, and routine. What we think today is that the prefrontal cortex is able to control these areas in the back. Remember that we were talking about these networks that go back and forth with information from the back and bring it to the front. When this control doesn't exist anymore, now the brain gets to wander without any type of direction. And what you see is what I read you in the story. First, the man got stuck in the story of the goal, the hen and the golden eggs, right? He was repeating, coming back and forth. So this will be a little bit the persistence that we see when it's damaged in this part of the brain. He got stuck in the task, he repeated the behavior, he get in a routine. Suddenly he jumped now to the other type of behavior that is seen when you have damage in the right side of the cortex, or the prefrontal cortex, which is extreme exploratory behavior, novelty seeking. He started to use numbers, the bus, he included new ideas, all of them under the same story. So what we see is that when this area of the brain is not controlling, this small word just get to connect with all the other ideas together and just jump from one node to the other. Remember that here we have motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, visual cortex in the back, proprioception, sound, and in the other side the same, but with less connection. So he got just moving from one side to another, while in the other one, he gets stuck in one network with hard time to move to the next one because of the connectivity. What does have to do all in general? So here I'm concluding the ideas. I want to put all the elements together that I told today. First, this is like a general idea of model for creativity, how creativity will work. First, we gather experience over time. So we learn this experience, we store them in the cortex. We have them there. That goes with the idea of we use all things to create novelty. Then, when we get to create, we test the idea against all stuff. So we get the idea, we say, okay, I'm gonna test something new. The first thing that we do, It's recognized that this idea, if it's real, really new or not, through pattern recognition in the left hemisphere. Once this idea passed as novelty, so it's not recognized by the left hemisphere, but actually recognized as something new for the right, we start to work consciously in the idea with the central executive network, which will bring what we were talking about, hyperfrontality. Our brain in the front right will be very, very busy working. The prefrontal cortex will work over association cortices, will be connected right to the back where all the information has been stored. Here again, we go with novelty, right information, right hemisphere involved. Small word networks will jump between information stored easy, so we will just matching them back and forth between the different areas that we have stored. Then you rest, leave time to wondering. The default mode network get active, we have hypofrontality, and then now the association cortices are alone, basically alone to work without the pressure from the area that is trying to look for associations in the front. This doesn't mean that the part in the back is not working. They continue now with the process of what they do usually, but now the information we think will start to jump and correlate without any control, creating things like the alignment. When you back to working the conscious idea, your central executive network is back in function, and then the dynamic network connectivity will bring the information that's being crossed over in the back to create these new ideas in the front. Judge the ideas, back them in the prefrontal cortex, select the idea that fit with the requirement of the creativity, and scream Eureka, and store the new skill information, pattern recognition, in the left hemisphere. We have a lot of experiments that show that part of this is true. We have also a lot of ideas that say that this is the most probable thing that will be happening. So I want to stop here